attending. If you don't know me, my name is Frank Kosh. I am the communications officer for the International Pest Risk Research Group. And this is part of our theoretically monthly, but we'll call it approximately monthly webinar series that we've been running pretty much since the beginning of 2021. And our presenter today is Dr. Emma Hudgins. Emma, I'm going to got your bio here. I'm going to as you guys may or may not know, I'm more casual about this than maybe I should be. But anyway, Emma, she uses computational methods to study the ecology, impacts, and management of invasive species at large scales. She's interested in uncovering broad generalities that emerge across species as a consequence of anthropogenic processes. She's also interested in creating better forecasts of future invasion patterns and better recommendations for invasive species management. She finished her PhD at McGill University in Brian Lung's lab in 2020 and is currently a postdoctoral fellow in Joe Bennett's lab at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. In addition to her postdoc work, she's part of the InvaCost project, it's a global data compilation for economic cost estimates associated with invasive species. So I'll just tell everyone, if you have a question or a comment during the presentation, if you would hold on to it, or better yet, go ahead and put that into the chat. I will be monitoring the chat, and when Emma finishes her presentation, we'll circle back to those questions. We may also give everyone a chance to ask questions live if they want. Just a reminder, we are recording this, and this will eventually end up on IPRRG's YouTube channel. And if you will, at the very end, once we've gotten through all the questions and answers, I will have, I think, just one reminder, one news announcement to make about our upcoming meeting in Athens. So if you will hold on for that at the very end. All right, so I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to Emma. And Emma, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Frank. Like I was saying before, it's really nice to even have an excuse to meet you, Frank, virtually. As everyone will see, we collaborate and continue to collaborate on some of this work. And so it's great to be able to share it both within the collaboration group and widely with this international meeting. So thanks for attending, everyone, today, and to everyone who watches this online after the webinar has been recorded. And I'm very grateful to Frank, who extended the invitation to present as part of this series. So today I'll be discussing my work over the past few years on forest pest invasions, primarily informed by large-scale models with a focus on urban invasions in Canada and the United States. So I've been studying what I call, and what many people call, the secondary invasion process of invasive species. So this is after they've been introduced into a new area outside of their native range and established reproducing populations there. But this secondary invasion process looks pretty much the same as what's happening with the primary invasion process that's happening at the global scale, where the secondary invasion process happens after a pest has established in a country and still begins to arrive at new locations, establish reproducing populations there, and then further expand their range. But I just explained this to say that the species that make up my data sets in these projects are only those currently established somewhere in a particular country. To inform invasive species policy, we need to know which species will have the greatest impacts across location and time in order to prioritize limited budgets. And importantly, we need to respond quickly because we know that invasions can go from barely detectable to infeasible for management very quickly. And here I'm showing a reproduction of what's been called the invasion curve, which depicts that as an invader increases its range or increases the area that it's invaded, It can start off as being feasible to manage, but by the time public awareness kicks in, it started this exponential phase where it can become really hard to manage. So it can be it can be too late to intervene meaningfully by the time people are aware of an invasive species. And I've spent most of my research career to date studying invasive forest pests, specifically in the United States, where you can see that the load of pests is particularly high in the Northeast and along the West Coast, coinciding with areas of high human activity. And I should say forest pests are those impacting trees and forest products. And while similar patterns exist in Canada with a hotspot around the Great Lakes region, the reason that I chose to study US forest pests, even though I was doing my PhD in Canada, was that they have a much better resolved data landscape. So thanks to the Federal Inventory and Analysis Program, the US has forest volume data that's been collected at the tree species level across the country. So this really facilitated the creation of models for the spread of these pests. You can think of US forest pest species as being divided into 4 groups or feeding guilds based on the way that they feed on their host tree species. And this includes wood-boring species like emerald ash borer that feed on the wood, defoliating species like spongy moth here that feed on the leaves of trees, sap-feeding insects that include aphid-like species like Balsamolia delgid shown here, and pathogens, which are not insects at all, and can include fungi or decline complexes, and include chestnut blight fungus, which I show here. So as you can see, this set of species has quite a wide variety of life histories and spans a large portion of the evolutionary tree. And lots of invasions have been documented in United States forests, but we don't actually have detailed historical spread information for many of these species. So where this pest was at multiple time points in the past is not really known for the vast majority of these species. And that's what motivated my search for creating general models to extrapolate that past invasion history in order to forecast future invasion history across these species. My talk today will focus mostly on forest pest impacts in urban areas. And I do this because urban tree health impacts most people, because most people in the world live in urban areas. And in Canada and the United States, 82% of people do. And urban trees are really important for well-being in urban areas because they do things like lower cooling costs, increase air quality, and improve citizens' mental and physical health outcomes. But all of these benefits are really put at risk by forest pests when they arrive in cities and have impacts on trees. And previous analyses suggest that the economic impacts of forest pests are going to be highest in urban areas because of the big losses that they're causing to urban trees. And this is because urban trees are really actively managed for liability reasons, because people really don't want them to fall on other people. And also because they include really big tracts of really susceptible species like ash trees. Here I'm just showing one street before and after emerald ash borer has passed through and killed all of the trees that are on this particular street, with the exception of a few other non-ash trees. Today, I'll be presenting 4 topics that range from a more basic ecological focus to a more applied and human focus in terms of forest pest management in North America. This work began during my PhD, which, as Frank mentioned, I did in Montreal at McGill University with Brian Leung, and it has continued into my postdoc at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, working with Joe Bennett's lab, and Joe is on the call today. Thanks for coming, Joe. I hope that in sharing a bit more about my work in Canada and the United States to this more international group, that I can share any useful strategies that we've uncovered in this work, but also to gain insights from what's being done in the rest of the world that can maybe inform future work. So in the first project, I'll be looking at results that I found on the impact of evolutionary history of host trees on the likelihood that pests can establish. So this uses phylogenetic information, or the relatedness of all host trees in the United States, to uncover whether there is a greater likelihood for invasion in more biodiverse or less biodiverse areas in terms of their evolutionary history. So one of the benefits of biodiversity that's often touted is resilience against disease. And this has extended to invasive species, which can be thought of as being analogous to disease, where biodiverse ecosystems are thought to buffer against invasion. In invasion biology terms, this is often called biotic resistance, but in epidemiological terms, it's often called the dilution effect, because the preferred host of a pathogen is mixed in or diluted with less preferred hosts of a pathogen, which allow the pathogen to have lower success than it would if it was just preferred hosts. And I'm showing an example here of Lyme disease, where there's a greater load of Lyme disease in this single species assemblage than in this multiple species assemblage. However, even though there's been empirical support for this pattern, we also see a conflicting positive association between host biodiversity and infestation globally, where the biodiversity hotspots of native species, shown in this map, are also the biodiversity hotspots of invasive species. So that would lead you to believe that there's actually a positive effect of biodiversity on infestation. So I aim to reconcile these two conflicting patterns in this project. And I did so by looking at the relationship between the actual composition of the biodiversity at each site and infestation. So not treating all biodiversity as equal, but looking at the biodiversity in relation to the preferred host of a pest. And this was based on the assumption that more closely related pests, which are shown closer to the zero in evolutionary distance from a preferred host, are going to have a greater risk of infestation, which is shown as more positive values on the y-axis. Whereas if you get to more distantly related species from a preferred host over here on the right pane, then you could actually have a dilution effect, or each added tree decreases the actual risk of infestation at a particular site. So this was my hypothesized relationship. And I used a phylogenetic tree of the host tree species for each pest, and predicted that I would observe this blue amplification effect at close distances and this yellow dilution effect at long distances, again, in terms of evolutionary dissimilarity from the preferred host that had been identified for each pest. And what we ended up finding was basically in line with these predictions, but also a little bit more complicated, as I feel like is usually the case. So we found that, as expected, tree species that were more closely related to the preferred host of a pest had this positive relationship, where this is the preferred host itself that's exactly at zero. And then we found that more distantly related trees to the preferred host of a particular pest did have this negative or dilution effect on the risk of a site for being infested. But then at long evolutionary distances, we started seeing this positive effect emerge again. So we went back to amplification at long evolutionary distances. And this was surprising. So to recap this, we found the expected relationship of density-dependent amplification of closely related trees at a site and density-dependent dilution of distantly related trees at a site. But we also found that very highly unrelated trees, and the x-axis here, I should say, is millions of years. So trees that were more than 20 million years separated from the preferred host tended to start having a positive effect on establishment again. And we still aren't sure exactly how to explain this, but our best explanation is one that's also been used for that amplification effect observed globally, where sites that have a greater biodiversity might have a really high diversity of microhabitats that are suitable for a large number of species of all types, whether they're native or invasive. But I'm happy to discuss other ideas that could be generating this pattern. So that's the first project, which again was much more of an ecological focus with less of an applied focus, although it does have implications for the biodiversity of forests and their relative risk. But the second project that I'll be talking about today is more of an economic focus, and it'll be an overview of a recent analysis I did for the street tree mortality and associated costs due to invasive insects in the US. And this project was done in collaboration with Frank Hosch and Mark Ambrose, as well as my PhD supervisor, Brian Leong. Sorry, the citation's cut off a bit here, during the last part of my PhD. So we created this economic impact estimate by combining 4 subcomponent models to produce these cost estimates, where the first was a model for how urban trees were distributed in the United States. The second was a model for forecasts of spread of different pest insects across the United States. The third was a model of, given that a pest is going to overlap in its distribution with an urban tree, how likely it is it to die given interaction with that pest? And then finally, we made some simple assumptions that dead and dying trees would be removed and replaced at a cost that was previously published in order to arrive at our final damage estimates in terms of numbers of trees and also management costs. So to start, we created street tree models to estimate the number and types of trees in each community. And these models relied heavily on one of Frank's previous publications, where they created an extensive database of urban tree inventories. And the database had street tree information for about 600 communities and was the result of many years of work. But this was still much lower than the total number of census designated places or urban communities across the United States, which is closer to 30,000. So I built some models to extrapolate from this smaller set of street tree inventories to predictions of what types of street trees and how big they would be across the United States, because we know that different species of street trees have different susceptibility to pests, and also that different sizes of trees have different costs to remove and replace. And I should say that this analysis focused on street trees, even though they're only about 2% of the total trees in urban areas, because they're most consistently recorded across these urban tree inventories. The pest spread portion of the framework was the result of basically the entirety of my PhD up to that point, where I had been focusing on building generalized models of the spread of US forest pests. So in the first project, I fit a single model with the same parameters applied to all 72 pest species that I had in my database that spanned all 4 of the feeding guilds that I mentioned. So pathogens, borers, sap feeders, and defoliators. And this spread model, which we call the generalized model, included a density-dependent population growth component and a dispersal component, where dispersal was a function of both distance, but also local tree information at source and destination sites and human population information at source and destination sites. And importantly, this type of model didn't need to be fit to historical distributional data. So you only needed to have a snapshot of where the pest is located at a given point of time and know how long it had been in the US up until that point, which was really all we had for most of the species in the database. I just wanted to give kind of a schematic overview of how my simulations work, because they're central to much of my work in forecasting species distributions. So they allow me to incorporate the spatial signal of species dispersal. And in these simulations, you can imagine that I start a pest out at some initial invasion location, which in the absence of additional information, I just assumed was the center of their host range. I then allowed pests to disperse up until the final date, when I compared their simulated distribution with their true distribution. And the simulated distribution was created by fitting certain parameters to the dispersal and growth equations in my simulations. And the fitting process happened by trying to minimize the discrepancies between the simulated and the true distribution of my species. So I was trying to minimize both false presences, where I predict that a pest is occurring, but in reality it's absent, and false absences, where I predict that a pest is not there, but in reality in my observed distribution it is. So I fit a set of parameters in my dispersal and growth equations that minimize these discrepancies. And in doing so, we were able to create a model that explained over 3/4 of the variation in pest range sizes and had roughly 74% locational accuracy across species. So this strong fit, combined with the fact that the model didn't have any species-specific parameters in it, really brought home the point that humans were causing the spread of these species to behave in really redundant ways across species, in remarkably similar ways, such that they could all be predicted with the same model. And here's an animation of my predictions over time. You can see they start pretty far back for older pests, and that in recent years, the populations really start to, or the pest load really starts to explode in the Great Lakes area. We later refined this general model with a few species-specific corrections. And we did this because we knew that this generalized model was impressive in its predictive ability, but that there would still be something gained if we included species-specific components to the spread model. But we didn't want to include species-specific components that relied on having that historical spread information because we didn't have that for the majority of species. So created something called semi-generalized models that included some parameters that were fit from keeping them the same from the generalized models, but some additional parameters that were species specific. And first of these was testing whether these simulations could start from better locations. So if we actually had information on a pest's initial introduction site, if that actually improved the prediction to start the simulation from that site rather than the center of the host range. And secondly, I tested whether incorporating for species where we knew that they had some climatic limitations beyond just where their hosts were distributed. For instance, the hemlock woolly adelgid has a threshold kind of beyond which it can't survive in cold winters. And so we tried to fit a threshold for this and include that in the model such that it improved our forecasts of the species distribution. And then as a final third component, I added a species-specific offset to the simulated dispersal rate. So the previous version of the model had the same baseline dispersal distance that all species kind of dispersed, but species varied in how well they were fitting to this model, where some were over-predicted, for instance, under-predicted. So this species, for example, spreads a little bit faster than average, and there could be many reasons why this is, one of which could be actually the phylogenetic diversity of the places where it's landing, like I mentioned in the first project. But our goal for this was really about prediction, not about uncovering the mechanisms. So we fit just this offset, not really looking into why the offsets were needed, but knowing that they improved our forecasts for future distributions. So this street tree model allowed us, so now I'm getting to the point where I'm putting together the different models. So there, we started with the urban tree distribution model, which told us where the susceptible hosts were. And then we had the pest spread model, which told us where the pests were going to be into the future. We could overlay them to get to this interaction map. So we have a species-specific prediction of which pests are going to interact with which street trees of which sizes in each community. The next step after this would be figuring out, given those interactions, how many of them are going to lead to mortality. And for this component, we fit a mortality model in a Bayesian framework to some very crude estimates of the severity of different pests on their hosts. So a previous publication by Kevin Potter and colleagues identified the top 5 pest threats to all US trees. And we use this database and its empirically estimated range of severities of each of these pests on host trees to get this distribution of pests and their severity on their host trees, which was more of a frequency distribution. So we had the highest number of pests in this innocuous category and a few rare pests like emerald ash borer out in this category. We then used a Bayesian approach to estimate what the actual distribution of these severity categories would be, so that instead of having to use these broad estimates, we could fully sample from this distribution when we were creating our economic estimates of impact, so that we were taking into account how uncertain some of these bins were. So for a final step, I put all of this together with cost information for the cost of removing and replacing trees of different sizes. And this allowed me to conclude that over the next 30 years, 1.5 million trees will be killed just in terms of street trees, which I will reiterate are just a small fraction of all of the trees in cities. And also that this burden is going to be highly spatially aggregated, where 95% of the cost, around that much, will be felt in less than a quarter of communities. And this cost amounts to roughly $31 million a year, or roughly $900 million over the next 30 years. And we also found that roughly 90% of these costs will be due to emerald ash borer-induced ash mortality. And in terms of other guilds, while they did have much lower costs, as expected, we did see that spongy moth would be the top impactor in terms of defoliators, and hemlock woolly adelgid was the top sap feeder. This model also allowed us to look at where those really high impact locations would be in terms of cities. And they all tend to be large urban population centers close to the leading edge of the emerald ash borer invasion, but also in places that have already seen a lot of mortality from emerald ash borer. So we're predicting that they're still going to continue to see a lot of mortality. And we also see urban centers that are more on the eastern seaboard, but that also still have a lot of ash trees that can be impacted, like New York City. And as a bit of a premonition, we also saw our models forecast a jump to the West Coast by EAB, and that this would lead to some pretty high impacts in urban centers over there, like Seattle. So far, as of 2 days ago, emerald ash borer has been detected for the first time on the West Coast in Oregon. So I don't know, we'll see if that results in the predicted impacts in Seattle, but I really hope that I'm not right in this instance. In addition to forecasting the damages of existing pests, I also looked at the potential risk for not yet invaded pests. And to do this, I created a list of what would be the worst hypothetical pest based on our information that could enter the US but hasn't yet established. And we thought this would be a wood borer because they had the highest impacts, of Asian origin because Asian origin species have the highest impacts in our database, and that it would attack maple and oak trees because beyond ash trees, once those are predominantly decimated, the remaining street trees that are most common are going to be maple and oak trees. And if there were a species that was as impactful as emerald ash borer on maple and oak trees, we could see $5 billion of damages in the next 30 years. And these would be particularly high if the pest entered via a southern port and successfully established. So we simulated potential spread trajectories from the top 3 ports by import volume, and we found that an initial introduction and establishment into the port of South Louisiana would be the greatest impact because it caused so many long distance jumps based on human movement. And one species that has some of these traits, but whose impacts in North America are still uncertain in terms of whether they could be as impactful as emerald ash borer, is the citrus longhorn beetle. And this is a species that has been discovered in the US, but has never successfully established to our knowledge. So I think it's something that should continue to be of high concern on the horizon. So to recap this section, I predict that most future US street tree impacts will be from emerald ash borer and that they will be concentrated in major urban centers. I should highlight that smaller urban centers may still lose a huge proportion of their trees, but just that these wouldn't accumulate to the same magnitude of costs as the larger urban centers. And that beyond the Midwest and Northeast, which are more expected locations of impact, we're also seeing potential for future impacts along the West Coast. And also, I think these results can show that there's a really high priority to prevent the introduction of new wood borers, particularly those of maple and oak, into the US. So those are the first 2 projects. And these first 2 projects have just been looking at business as usual or historical patterns in invasions and their impacts. But during my postdoc here at Carleton with Joe Bennett, I've been transforming what were previously predictive models of spread and impact to more prescriptive frameworks of how we might change spread and impact with different management strategies. And the fundamentals of this particular optimization project were first designed when I did a visiting research fellowship at the University of Queensland with Eve McDonald-Madden and her group, which does a lot of different decision theory approaches and optimizations for different conservation management contexts, and also got me interested in joining Joe's lab for my postdoc, where I've continued to work on these questions. So I've been working on building optimizations using emerald ash borer as an initial case study. And this was for a few reasons. The first of which is that emerald ash borer is the species causing the greatest impacts from my previous economic assessment. And the second I'll get to in the next slide, but in general, I was motivated to do this because the previous project left me with forecasts of how emerald ash borer could spread and distributional estimates of where its susceptible hosts are. And so based on the output of these previous models, I can change my simulated spread based on different management interventions to modify these forecasts in different ways in order to simulate the outcomes of different management strategies and determine which management strategies would lead to the lowest exposure of street ash to emerald ash borer in the future. So the second reason I was interested in emerald ash borer is because their management environment has been changing recently. So emerald ash borer always used to be managed by a quarantine region where wood movement and wood product movement was restricted beyond this range in red. But in the last couple of years, the United States Department of Agriculture has stopped enforcing this quarantine region. I should say that some states still have their own quarantines, but instead the entire budget has been redirected towards research and deployment of emerald ash for parasitoids. So these are parasitic wasps that lay their eggs in either emerald ash borer larvae or eggs, and they're able to kill emerald ash borer in that way. And this was a new strategy, and it had been implemented because it was claimed that because emerald ash borer is still spreading with the quarantine region, that it's not working. That's not to say that if there was nothing there, it wouldn't be spreading even faster. So I wanted to examine alternative scenarios of investment in one or both of these management strategies in some mixture to see what would actually be optimal in terms of my models. So I set up my optimization to allow the choice of two different types of restrictions of movement. One restricting the entry of wood products or wood, and this would be more targeting immigration of emerald ash borer. One targeting the exit of wood products, more targeting emigration of emerald ash borer from a site. And then finally, one releasing these parasitic wasps and decreasing the emerald ash borer population locally. Something that made this problem really interesting to me, but also quite complex, is that some of the management that's being done actually involves moving organisms. So parasitoid wasps can spread and they can move around. And so they need to be modeled kind of simultaneously with the movement of emerald ash borer. And so biological control release of wasps is not usually done to save the emerald or the ash trees locally. It's usually done in areas that already have a lot of emerald ash borer and they have a sufficient density to which those wasps can parasitize and establish. And then from there, the wasps can spread to other locations and maybe save some of those trees. So this is a really interesting problem where we have to account for this dispersal. And because this made the problem quite complex, I ended up doing it, and because we know very little about how these wasps spread, I ended up doing a very basic parasitoid spread model to neighboring cells, which I should mention in all my simulations are 50 by 50 kilometers. And so they have some sort of delayed growth and also delayed dispersal function happening. I implemented the problem in Gurobi with a lot of help from Dennis, who I should have shouted out at the beginning of this project. He's been really crucial for helping me with the optimization side of things, particularly with transforming it all into a set of equations and explanations that make sense for other people. And so this gets implemented actually as a mixed integer linear program, which was part of the techniques that I was learning at UQ in Australia during the visiting research internship. And the reason why you need this mixed integer linear program is because the management of any site at a given time point is going to impact the density and the dispersal capacity to all other sites, which will then have ripple effects on all other sites across time. So you need to understand all the possible interactions between all cells in this simulation. And that makes the problem really computationally intense. And so you have to implement it in this mixed integer linear programming way so that it's actually feasible to solve in a reasonable amount of time. And I did this by using the same equations that govern the growth and dispersal of pest insects in my simulation, but that account for some proportional reduction in either immigration or emigration of pests to and from sites, or a proportional reduction. You can think of it as a mortality term that gets added to the density-dependent population growth equation in each cell for that biological control release. So what we've found so far, and there's a lot going on in this figure, so I just want to explain that we use scenarios of varying amounts of efficiency of our different techniques. So 10, 30, and 50% reduction in population density of emerald ash borer with biological control, which are shown here for 10, here for 30, and here for 50. And the y-axis is the number of ash trees that get exposed to emerald ash borer over the 30 years. And so lower is better because you don't want to expose trees to emerald ash borer lest they die. And then we have 3 different scenarios of quarantine efficiency. So whether you can reduce the number of individuals leaving or entering sites by 30, 60, or 90%. And so what we found was that the best strategies are those that spend the majority of their budget on on quarantines and restrict biological control use to just a handful of central sites. And that looking at the difference between a strategy that only uses biological control here in red and the highest efficiency strategy for quarantines, we could be saving up to 1 million street trees in the next 30 years, which would amount to over $1 billion in management costs, just by examining and implementing a mixed strategy rather than relying entirely on biological control. And here I'm just showing where the sites get chosen for each of these strategies, where biological control tends to get chosen in major urban centers, likely because there's a high density of emerald ash borer in these areas, so the pest can establish, but also that they contribute a lot to the dispersal and the long distance jumps. There's interestingly also a biological control site suggested on the West Coast, and quarantines that focus on emigration, which are more similar to the previous quarantine boundary shown in purple here, are targeted in the core of the invasion, which has a higher density of emerald ash borer. But then as that density gets controlled and lessened, you tend to see more of a focus on limiting the entry of new propagules of EAB over time. And this is consistently also done on the West Coast as well. So to recap this section, my models would suggest that using a single strategy, particularly focusing only on biological control, can result in suboptimal impacts for emerald ash borer and suboptimal management. And there can be huge both cost and conservation benefits to using these optimizations to help inform decisions by simulating alternative scenarios of management actions. Okay, so that is the end of the quantitative side of what I'd like to present today. So you can breathe a big sigh. But the last project will be looking more at the human side of conservation as it applies to forest pest management. And it's very much big picture, aspirational work trying to tackle how we think about species invasions and how we might move the field forward in terms of pest management, particularly focused on forest pests, again, in Canada and the United States. So I started this project because I felt like myself and my fellow researchers were very disconnected from what was actually happening in terms of forest pest management. And this, I came to this realization by first interacting with the Forest Pest Management Forum, which is like an intergovernmental agency annual meeting in Canada. And there's an equivalent one in the United States, where government agencies and NGOs and provincial managers all get together and talk about forest pest management. And I realized that we were missing from this conversation and that we could really benefit from adding our voices and listening to other voices during those conversations. So I wanted to reach out to people working in all different facets of forest pest management, understand what they think that the priorities are, and see how we might change our more historical approaches to more cutting edge approaches, or where the feasibility or uncertainty is just too high of these approaches, and where we might still have gaps in our understanding. So to approach this question, I asked roughly a suite of 30 experts, including Frank and Dennis, to outline their top priorities for research and action in invasive forest pest management. And this was a free form ask, and sometimes it looked like email exchanges, sometimes it was Zoom calls, but I eventually compiled all of their thoughts into this survey, where I sent out this survey which had a list of priorities to all respondents. And they included people from government, academia, private science and policy researchers, and NGO employees who answered the survey, where we got people to comment on the importance, the feasibility, and the uncertainty of these different strategies, and also left space for people to have more free-form feedback. So in the first portion of this survey approach, we ended up finding a lot of research directions that were repeated by a lot of respondents to the survey. And it ended up being very heartening because a lot of it was stuff that I have been trying to work on. The first of which was increasing the number of decision support tools that are available to balance different scenarios of management action and the trade-offs associated with each of these. And the second was related to this. It was looking at actually putting a cost on being reactive instead of proactive to managing a species, or waiting and not doing anything to manage a species versus taking action and actually putting a dollar value to that inaction scenario, which ended up being something that I've been working on with Danish Ahmed at the Gulf University of Science and Technology through the InvaCost initiative, where we built mathematical models of the growth in different types of costs related to invasions over time, both management and damage, and looked at how that total cost of management plus damage could be decreased by doing that management earlier rather than later. And we were only able to do this for one example, which was the Asian tiger mosquito, because there's still not a lot of data on different scenarios of action and inaction over time. But we found that if we had managed this mosquito, which causes yellow fever, so it's not a forest pest, but if we had managed it even 7 years earlier, we would have saved $4.5 billion. So using this type of approach more broadly within forest pest invasions could have some really beneficial impacts on decision makers, because they're actually required to confront that there is a cost to doing nothing. And then finally, many respondents again said that there are synergistic impacts between climate change and invasions that are still not very well understood because they tend to be tackled separately. So building off of the survey responses, I ran a 2-day workshop in January 2022 with a smaller group of experts. It was small partly because it was supposed to be in person, but then at the very last minute, Omicron kind of made our plans not make any sense. So it happened online, and it included Indigenous knowledge holders, members of the Canadian and US Forest Service, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and academics from several universities. And the workshop really allowed us to dig into the main themes that emerged from the survey and subsequent discussion. And one of these was how complex the landscape of forest pest management is, both in Canada and the United States, and how knowledge can really easily get lost among this network. And I'm only depicting it here for Canada, but there's a lot of folks working at very different stages of invasions, whether it's surveillance at the border or of secondary spread, where it's the people who are actually on the ground cutting trees, which is usually municipalities, people who are looking at priorities and risk assessments or ecological studies of invaders within the government, people who are regulating the actual management responses that can be done, like Health Canada regulating chemicals, and people assessing compliance, for instance, like international phytosanitary standard compliance through the CFIA. And for certain subsets of species like spongy moth, we might see coordinated management of municipalities within provinces, but it's really quite a mess. And there are NGOs like the Invasive Species Center in Canada that do help this knowledge transfer, but it's still quite challenging, especially we highlighted the different priorities of organizations. Like Canada Border Services Agency is much more concerned with drug trafficking and things that are more directly tied to human safety, but they are also tasked with biosecurity. So there's a lot, it's quite a tricky problem. And also we identified that some people and some groups are entirely missing or only have transient associations with this network. And one of those groups is universities, where I found this was kind of my association with the network only through having found out about the Forest Pest Management Forum and the fact that I communicate my research through academic journals. So we're not really speaking through the same communication channels. And this was also true for Indigenous groups who have been living on the forested lands that are traditional and unceded in many cases across Canada and the United States, and may have a poor relationship with forest managers in both countries, and also have very limited funding and capacity to have point people for forest management, but who have a lot of knowledge that can be really valuable in sustainably managing forests. So in this first barriers to communication section, we thought that some solutions could be appointing specific liaison people within particularly the more well-funded organizations within the government to work on diversifying their communication styles, for instance, by doing radio programs, attending community events, and even using tools like Facebook to communicate both with municipalities, but also with Indigenous groups. And also having universities really focus and prioritize liaison people and non-scientific communication strategies as well. In terms of building relationships with Indigenous communities and knowledge holders, this also came out as a major strategy or a major priority. And the big focus here was that the relationships have to be built over the long term, which is not really amenable to the funding cycles that are occurring within government or academia, and that they must be proactive. So several examples were given of communities being told after the fact or at the very last minute that biological control or pesticides were going to be released in their area, and that there wasn't actually an early communication or relationship building that happened prior to that. Part of this can really benefit from face-to-face communication, which has gotten increasingly challenging in the last few years. And also really central to this is acknowledging Indigenous knowledge as being just as credible and real and useful as Western scientific knowledge within these conversations. Something that's really not discussed within the forest pest management literature, but where there have been a few examples of partnerships with Indigenous communities, particularly in the emerald ash borer response, that seem really powerful and like a great example for the future. And then finally, we highlighted urban areas as being both the highest risk, some of the highest risk areas, but the poorest funded areas of forests in Canada and the United States, where smaller municipalities don't even really know what trees they have, where the inventory data is so sparse and not funded. And so communities don't even know what risks are there and how to respond proactively. And that more funding should be allocated for municipal tree inventorying, but also for urban forest management, given that there can be really important bridgeheads for invasions and because trees are in such stressful conditions there. So to recap this portion, invasion management, it's not new, but we really got into how highly siloed it is, including that it completely misses certain stakeholders and partners and rights holders. And also that some of the highest risk areas, like urban areas, for future invasions remain understudied. So thank you for listening to what has been a bit of a whirlwind tour of my research trajectory. And I'm happy to discuss more about the evolutionary history, invasibility relationship, these economic estimates of street tree impacts, and how we might better manage the worst invader in US urban areas, and how we might implement these lessons that we uncovered for the future of forest invasions. So thank you very much again to my current and past labs and to my collaborators at the Canadian and US Forest Service and everyone who participated in my workshop and survey. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Emma. Oh, I see a clap. We should all do our clap, little clap reaction. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, so we do have time for questions and hopefully answers, right, Emma? But is it okay if we, so I mean, Melanie's running this, but I assume it's all right, Melanie, if we were to go a few minutes past the hour.
You're good.
All right, very good. So, all right. So if anybody has a question, you could raise your hand, or I guess you could just turn your mic on and start talking. Or if you prefer, you can put it in the chat and I will relay the question to Emma. All right, somebody's got to go first.
Okay, I'll put my hand up. I won't turn my camera on. It's far too early in the morning. Emma, I'm based in New Zealand. I'm really interested in what you've presented today. Absolutely fascinating. And I wonder how translatable your models are to other countries, firstly, but also from a New Zealand perspective, I guess we're highly reliant on production forestry for our economy, and whether your models translate into, for example, Pinus radiata and the threats of pests coming into that. Sorry, it's probably quite a big question, but I just wondered.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you for tuning in so early. My goal for this work is to first, well, in terms of translating to other countries, is to translate them to Canada. That's a bit of a challenge because Canadian forest data is quite sparse and mostly based on remote sensing. So I guess my first step, if I were thinking about translating this information to another country, is to figure out if there is a good understanding of where the hosts of different pests are located, because we were restricting the spread model to places where there were known hosts of a given pest. But other than that, as long as there are data on the distribution of different species over time, even if it's a single snapshot, and we know how long, or we have estimates of how long they've been in a country, and we have some sort of which they can spread, which should ideally be places where their hosts exist, then the model could be adapted to that context. And that is really what I'm trying to do. And I have adapted it for agricultural pests like spotted lanternfly with other researchers. That's still in development, but it does seem to be modular enough that it could be extended to other systems. In terms of forest production, if you're asking about economic impacts, I think the forest production impacts are a little bit more challenging to estimate because there is an element of substitutability of trees for other trees. And at least in my supervisor, Brian Leung's work previously, they found that the forest timber losses from emerald ash borer were quite a bit lower compared to urban impacts to emerald ash borer, just because trees could be substituted with other trees in the harvest, and because salvage logging still allows you to recoup a large fraction of the value of trees as they die. But in terms of actually looking at spatial locations of spread and interactions between where trees are located and where pests are located, that's definitely something that can be predicted in any geography, as long as you have some baseline data to calibrate the model.
Let's hope you've got your royalty models all set up for as this goes. That's really interesting.
Thank you. I should say that all my code for all of the projects I presented today is available on my GitHub page, and you're welcome to use it for your own purposes as long as you're citing where you got it from.
We have one more question. I want to say first for Fiona, this issue with pines is something that we're exploring in the US, in the southeastern US, and that is a lot about that crossover, something new coming in. I mean, obviously we have a suite of native pests, but we're concerned in the southeastern US that something novel, particularly a pathogen or a complex, might come in and proceed undetected and decimate not just pines are not a street tree, but there's certainly plenty of them in urban areas, but it's that jumping into production forestry. And there's a task force working on this, the Pine Pandemic Preparedness Plan, or P4 task force. And I will try and share some more about that at some point in this series. So stay tuned. I don't have a whole lot that's really quantitative. It's more sort of concept now, but this is not about me. It's about Emma's stuff. So Emma, I have one question. This is from Brittany. So Brittany Barker. So, all right. So hi, Emma. Thanks for the really interesting talk. I was wondering how you were able to create a spatialized risk model when data on tree inventory are sparse for most areas. I may have missed this info. How did you quantify uncertainty?
Sorry, I muted myself there. Thank you, Brittany. Yeah, I actually skipped out on that part of my presentation, but I can share my screen and go back to it. 1 second. Can you see my slides again now? No?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So we had kind of a complicated approach that I didn't get into about how we estimated street tree distributions. We did it at the genus level because species level recording wasn't consistent across the street tree inventory data, but we used a combination of regression trees and GAMs, where we looked at whether it was better to include all tree genera in the same model or fit genus models separately, and this depended on the rarity of the genus and how distinct its own patterns of distribution were, and where we had lower amounts of data for certain genera, sometimes it was better to fit a global model. Anyway, we fit some combination of models that was a function of both socioeconomic predictors in cities and environmental variables in cities, because there's also pretty distinct cultural differences across the US, which Frank has looked at in some of his work as well. And we found decent fits for the observed data, but obviously we only had a small subset of the inventories recorded. So it is a big piece of uncertainty, and there were so many sources of uncertainty in this model that we didn't simulate across all of them, but we did simulate the species level composition we predicted within each genus and did several rounds of simulation of that. I should say that our order of magnitude estimates didn't change a lot across any of our scenarios and sensitivity analyses. So roughly around the 1.5 million trees, it could be 1 or it could be 2 million trees, but around that was kind of what we found. But we mainly focused on the dominant sources of uncertainty, which were how likely trees were to die as a function of their interaction with different pests, which were much more variable than any of our street tree distributional estimates. But yeah, that I should say that all the maps that I presented today are our mean estimates, and they don't show the error associated, but those maps are available if you go to the GitHub page associated with the paper and in the supplement of the associated paper.
All right. So, oh yeah, here's one more question. This is, so first Brittany says, thanks. The smiley face emoji. And then, so this is from Rachel Holmes. Thank you for an excellent presentation, Emma. And moreover, thank you for the research you are doing. This is the science we need. I'm the urban forestry strategist for the Nature Conservancy North America, and I look forward to following up with you. Lee Greenwood, a colleague in forest health protection for TNC, is also on the call and will join me. So that sounds like an invitation for something else. So
yeah. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Rachel says she's in the throes of Lyme disease and not looking her best. Oh, well, thank you for coming anyway, Rachel, and we totally understand.
And by the way, guys, I really loved your example, but you make Lyme disease look really cute, which it is not, but really appreciated that.
Well, I'll jump in for Rachel. It was a great presentation, Emma, really outstanding stuff. And I thought, so I run a lot of the national educational programming on firewood. So I thought it was particularly interesting, your example of quarantines versus biological control, and the fact that having a matrix of the two results in very demonstrably better results in pest containment. So I think that's really important stuff. And actually, one of the questions I was going to ask you, so I'm glad that Rachel sort of jolted me out of complacency by calling me out, was whether or not you've created any presentations on that particular work for the Emerald Ash Borer University presentation series that's run in the United States. It's found on the emeraldashborer.info website. Are you familiar with that one?
I have watched some of those presentations before, and I do have a separate presentation that's just on that work, but I've never presented for EAB University.
They do have a really outstanding reach for their audience. So I would be happy to introduce you and suggest to them that you give a presentation solely on that topic, because I think it would be of great interest. I've done presentations for them before, and typical attendance is 50 to 150, depending on the time of year and the topic.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely be interested.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Lee. No, long time no see. I guess we'll see you virtually again.
I know
all
it's
right,
hiding
cool.
in the background.
It's very good. All right, so I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I don't want to leave anyone out. So if there's anyone else who has a question, go ahead and you can, I guess, just go ahead and come off mute and ask your question. Otherwise, we'll wrap this up in the next minute or two. Okay, well, I think that's long enough. Emma, I want to say thank you again for joining us. Thank you for doing this presentation. There was so much in there that we could discuss, but we'll have to do that another time. The picture of the citrus longhorn beetle brought up me. That alone gave me a lot of things to think about. I was like, but that's for another time. All right, I'm going to, I cannot forget this. I want to mention one last time. Again, this is brought to you by the International Pest Risk Research Group. And I want to remind everyone that we are having, finally, and hopefully having, Emma put her email in the chat, email address there. But yes, I wanted to mention we're supposed to have an annual meeting in Athens in October, and we are currently asking for abstract submissions. It is open. It is an online submission form. If you go to our website, pestrisk.org, and go to the IPRRG 2022 page, you will find the link. It's actually posted in 2 or 3 other places. The deadline is this Friday. Although if you know my email address, or if you can track it down, you can always contact me and beg for an extension. I probably would give one, because I just try and get them in by Friday. We're trying to have, we've already had a number of submissions. It's looking like we're going to have a pretty good meeting. I think everyone's excited for the possibility of doing this again after so long. And other than that, I'll just say, everyone, thank you for attending. I will, after this is over, Melanie will send me the recording, or she'll post a link, and I will have this up on IPRRG's YouTube channel. And I will just say, please, if you are not a subscriber to the IPRRG YouTube channel, please subscribe. I think the link is also in the chat at the top. Melanie, you put that up there, didn't you? There it is. We're trying to get to I don't know what the rule is. I think 100 subscribers or something. We have some, we're close. And then we get there, then we can actually come up with a YouTube name that is more than a random alphanumeric sequence. So I'm going to leave it at that. Emma, do you have anything else you want to say, or can we close this out?
Just wanted to say thank you very much for the invitation, and I will definitely be keeping in touch with IPRRG. So thank you.
Richard, thank you so much again. And all right, so long, everyone. I will send next webinar. I will keep sending information about our upcoming events. Thanks again, Emma. And so long, everybody.